The red-hot iron sizzled against the flesh. The smell of burning skin mixed with the screams that echoed off the cold dungeon stones. Marguerite Porret, only 23 years old, writhed in the metal chair as the iron melted her legs. Her pleas of innocence were lost in the heavy air of Paris in 1310. The inquisitors remained impassive, repeating the same question about demonic pacts she had never made. If this kind of story deserves to be remembered, support this project by subscribing to the channel and leaving your comment on how human cruelty can be combated today. Medieval Europe breathed fear. Every woman who dared to think differently, who questioned, who simply existed outside the imposed standards, became a target. The Catholic Church had established the Inquisition as the armed branch of the faith, and secular courts followed the same pattern of terror. Women were especially vulnerable, considered more susceptible to sin, morally weaker, more prone to diabolical seduction. Marguerite Porret was no different from thousands of others. Born in Hainaut, a prosperous region between France and Flanders, she grew up in a wealthy merchant family. Her father sold imported fabrics, and her mother handled the children's education, a rarity for women of the time. Marguerite learned to read and write, luxuries that few possessed. It was precisely this education that condemned her. Marguerite wrote, "Her words spoke of a direct relationship between the human being and God, without the need for ecclesiastical intermediaries. Her texts circulated discreetly among small groups of women who gathered to pray and discuss spiritual matters. Bishop William of Paris soon found out. In 1306, he ordered all of Marguerite's writings to be publicly burned. She was to recant, deny her words, and beg for forgiveness. Marguerite refused. She continued to write, continued to distribute her ideas. For her, the truth could not be negotiated. Her arrest came in 1308. Marguerite was dragged from her home on a cold winter morning. Her neighbors watched in silence. To help meant sharing her fate. She was taken to the dungeons of the episcopal palace, where she would await trial for over a year. The interrogations began gently. Learned priests tried to persuade her through theology, quoting biblical passages, arguing for the necessity of the ecclesiastical hierarchy. Marguerite responded with her own interpretation of the scriptures, demonstrating knowledge that both impressed and irritated her captors. When words proved insufficient, the inquisitors changed their strategy. Torture was seen as a way to save the soul, better to suffer on earth than to burn in eternal hell. Marguerite was taken to the interrogation room, where metal instruments gleamed in the torchlight. The first session used ropes. Marguerite was hung by her wrists, with weights tied to her feet, her joints dislocated with dry cracks. She screamed, she cried, but she held fast to her convictions. There were no demonic pacts, no intentional heresies, just a woman trying to understand her faith. The months dragged on. Marguerite wasted away in the damp prison, fed only stale bread and dirty water. Her health deteriorated rapidly. Her hair turned white, her skin took on a grayish tone, her hands trembled constantly. Still, she refused to renounce her writings. It was then that the inquisitors decided to use the iron chair. The instrument had recently arrived from Germany, where it had proven effective in converting heretics. It was a metal chair with arms and a back covered in sharp spikes. The victim was tied down firmly, and the chair was heated from below until the iron glowed red hot. On the morning of March 15, 1310, Marguerite was dragged to the torture chamber. 2 executioners stripped her and tied her to the diabolical chair. The ropes cut into her skin, already wounded from previous tortures. Beneath the chair, coals were slowly lit. The heat began gently, almost comforting after the cold of the dungeon. Marguerite even closed her eyes, imagining she was once again near the fireplace in her home. But the temperature rose inexorably. The metal grew warm, then hot, then unbearable. The first screams echoed when the iron touched her skin. Marguerite tried to pull away, but the ropes held her fast. The smell of burning flesh began to fill the room. The inquisitors remained impassive, reciting prayers in Latin. For hours, the ordeal continued. To every question about witchcraft, Marguerite denied it between screams. Her legs burned slowly, the skin melting and sticking to the glowing metal. When she finally fainted, her injuries were already irreversible. But Marguerite was not alone in this hell. In other corners of Europe, women faced equally brutal tortures for crimes they never committed. Isabella de Mora grew up in an isolated tower in southern Italy. The daughter of an impoverished baron, she spent her youth as a virtual prisoner in her own castle. Her brothers controlled her every move, every word, every thought. For Isabella, literature was the only possible escape. She wrote poems, verses about landscapes she had never visited, about loves she had never lived, about freedoms she had never experienced. Her words were delicate, melancholic, filled with a deep sadness that touched those who read them. A bookseller discovered her writings during a visit to the castle. Impressed by the quality of the verses, he offered to publish them in Naples. Isabella secretly agreed, using a male pseudonym to protect her identity. The poems were a success. Learned readers speculated about the identity of the mysterious poet who wrote with such sensitivity about female suffering. Some suspected it was a woman, but the idea seemed impossible. Women did not possess sufficient literary talent. The discovery came through an intercepted letter. Isabella maintained a secret correspondence with Diego Sandoval de Castro, a Spanish nobleman who admired her verses. The letters were platonic, discussing only literature and philosophy. But for Isabella's brothers, any male contact represented family dishonor. In 1546, Isabella was formally accused of adultery. It did not matter that she had never met Diego in person. The letters were sufficient evidence of improper behavior. The law was clear. Married women who maintained secret correspondence with men were committing adultery, even if only spiritually. The trial was swift. Isabella tried to defend herself, explaining that the letters were only about art and literature. Her arguments were ignored. Women lacked the intellectual capacity for deep philosophical discussions. If they corresponded with men, it could only be for carnal reasons. The sentence included public torture as an example to other women. Isabella would be subjected to the breast ripper, an instrument designed specifically to punish crimes related to female sexuality. The local population was summoned to watch the spectacle. The breast ripper consisted of 4 metal claws connected to a central screw. The claws were positioned around the victim's breasts and slowly tightened, crushing the mammary tissue until it was completely destroyed. The agony could last for hours. Isabella was dragged to the city's central square on a sunny September morning. Hundreds of people crowded to watch. Children were brought by their parents to learn about the consequences of disobedience. Women whispered prayers, knowing that any of them could be in Isabella's place. The executioner positioned the instrument as Isabella begged for mercy. Her pleas were interpreted as an admission of guilt. The first turns of the screw drew desperate screams. Isabella confessed to imaginary crimes, promised never to write again, swore eternal fidelity to any man who would free her. It was no use. The instrument continued to tighten, to crush, to destroy. Pieces of flesh fell to the dusty square floor. Isabella would lose consciousness and be revived with cold water to continue her suffering. Her agony lasted 3 hours. When she finally died at the age of 25, Isabella had been completely disfigured. Her last verses were never found, likely burned by her brothers to eliminate evidence of her dishonor. One of the greatest poets of the Italian Renaissance vanished from history, a victim of a society that punished women for dreaming of intellectual freedom. Meanwhile, in 17th century France, Catherine Monvoisin faced her own accusations. Known as La Voisin, she was a midwife and healer in the suburbs of Paris. She attended to poor women who had no access to doctors, prepared homemade remedies, and assisted in difficult births. Catherine had a respectable reputation in her community. Women sought her out not only for medical issues, but also for advice on family problems. She knew how to listen, offered a shoulder to cry on, and distributed hope where there was despair. Her downfall began when some noble clients started visiting her home. Duchesses and countesses came secretly seeking potions to win lovers or eliminate rivals. Catherine prepared harmless mixtures, water with aromatic herbs that had no effect beyond the psychological. The scandal erupted in 1679. Madame de Montespan, mistress of King Louis XIV, was accused of trying to poison other royal favorites. During interrogations, she mentioned buying potions from Catherine. The midwife was immediately arrested as a suspect in a conspiracy against the crown. The investigation revealed a complex network of nobles involved in alleged witchcraft practices. Catherine became the perfect scapegoat, a commoner who could be sacrificed to protect powerful aristocrats. She knew too much about the secrets of the French nobility. The trial was a sham. Catherine was accused of poisoning dozens of nobles over 20 years. The evidence was non-existent, only testimonies from other tortured prisoners who would say anything to escape the pain. Catherine denied all charges, but her word was worthless against that of aristocrats. When the torture began, the inquisitors decided to use the pear of anguish. The instrument had recently been perfected by German craftsmen specializing in torture equipment. It consisted of a segmented metal pear that could be inserted into the victim's mouth, anus, or vagina. Once inserted, the pear was expanded by a screw, tearing the internal tissues. When used in the mouth, it broke teeth and facial bones. The suffering was indescribable, and few survived the experience. Catherine was taken to the torture chamber on a cold January morning in 1680. 4 executioners held her down while a 5th positioned the metal pear. She begged, cried, and promised to confess to any crime they wanted to hear. But the inquisitors wanted specific names. They needed Catherine to confirm the involvement of Madame de Montespan and other noblewomen in the alleged poisoning plot. She had to provide convincing details about satanic rituals, black masses, and demonic pacts. The pear was inserted into her mouth with technical care. Catherine tried to keep her lips closed, but the executioner's strength was irresistible. The cold metal touched her tongue, her teeth, the roof of her mouth. Then it began to expand. The first cracks were her teeth. Catherine tried to scream, but the instrument blocked her throat. Blood trickled from the corners of her mouth as the pear continued to grow. Her eyes widened with terror and pain. The facial bones began to break, first the mandible, then the maxilla, finally the bone structures around her eyes. Catherine's face deformed grotesquely as she writhed in silent agony. Miraculously, she survived. When the pair was finally removed, Catherine was unrecognizable. Her face had become a shapeless mass of broken flesh and bone. She would never be able to speak clearly or eat normally again. But her suffering was not over. Other women faced equally brutal tortures in different parts of Europe, all paying terrible prices for crimes they never committed. Marie Chambon was only 19 when famine struck her village in rural France. The winter of 1691 was especially cruel, and the previous harvests had been insufficient. Children were dying of malnutrition, while the feudal lords' stockpiles remained untouched. Marie was an orphan and cared for 3 younger siblings. She worked as a seamstress, but her earnings barely paid the rent for the hovel where they lived. When her youngest brother, only 5 years old, began to waste away from hunger, Marie made a desperate decision. On a freezing pre-dawn morning, she broke into the local bakery and stole 3 loaves of bread. She had no intention of causing a loss. She planned to work extra to compensate the owner as soon as she found a better job. For Marie, it was a matter of survival, but feudal laws were inflexible. Theft, even motivated by hunger, was a capital crime. The baker had lost goods worth 6 sous, enough to buy 3 chickens. For this fortune, Marie would face the maximum penalty. The trial lasted less than an hour. Marie confessed immediately, explaining her desperate situation. She brought her 3 small siblings to the court, hoping to move the judges. The children were skin and bones, clearly malnourished. The magistrates remained impassive. The law was clear, and exceptions would encourage other crimes. If the poor could steal when they were hungry, where would it end? Private property had to be protected above any humanitarian consideration. Marie was sentenced to death by public breaking on the wheel. She would be executed by a method reserved for the most heinous crimes. Her agony would serve as an example to other peasants who might think of challenging the established order. The breaking wheel was a solid, circular wooden structure, mounted horizontally on a vertical base. The victim was tied with arms and legs outstretched, and the executioner systematically broke each bone with heavy hammers. The process began with the toes, and gradually moved up. First the small bones, then the large ones, always in precise anatomical order. The victim remained conscious throughout the process, feeling every fracture, every bone, splinter, piercing muscles, and internal organs. Marie was taken to the central square on a February morning in 1692. The entire population was summoned to watch, including children, who were meant to learn about the consequences of disobedience. Her 3 siblings were forced to watch from the front row. The executioner began with Marie's right foot. The first blow shattered her smaller toes with dry cracks that echoed across the silent square. Marie screamed a high-pitched sound that pierced the soul of anyone who heard it. Her siblings cried desperately. Each hammer blow was methodically applied. Ankles, shins, knees, all broken in precise sequence. Marie begged for mercy, promised never to steal again, swore to work for the baker for free for the rest of her life. Her pleas were ignored. The executioner continued his work with professional precision, systematically breaking the bones in her legs. Blood flowed from the open fractures, forming red pools on the stone ground. By the time he reached her arms, Marie had lost her voice from screaming. Only hoarse groans came from her shattered throat. Her eyes, however, remained conscious, recording every moment of agony. The final blows were to her ribs. Each fracture punctured her lungs and other vital organs. Marie was still breathing when her last ribs were shattered, but her breath had become an agonizing death rattle. It took her 6 hours to die. Long enough for the entire village to hear her final moans, for her siblings to lose their sanity watching, for a terrible lesson to be etched into the collective memory. But there were still darker stories waiting to be told, in places where human cruelty had reached almost unbelievable levels. In Seville, in the year 1559, Ana de Mendoza awoke in the convent of Santa Clara, knowing it would be her last day on earth. The daughter of the Duke of Pastrana had committed the unforgivable crime of publicly questioning Catholic doctrine, challenging bishops and theological debates a woman should never have engaged in. Ana grew up in a family of high Spanish nobility. Her education was refined. She spoke 5 languages, had studied classical philosophy, and mastered mathematics and astronomy. Her father, a progressive man by the standards of the time, believed that intelligent women honored their families through knowledge. But Philip II's Spain did not tolerate dissent, especially from women. When Ana publicly contested the sale of indulgences during a solemn mass, she sealed her fate. Worse still, she had quoted biblical texts in Greek to support her arguments, a demonstration of erudition that humiliated the clerics present. The Spanish Inquisition moved quickly. Ana was accused of Lutheran heresy, a crime punishable by death. Her noble lineage did not matter. The church was above the aristocracy when it came to defending the faith. The instrument chosen for her execution was the Iron Maiden, a metal sarcophagus in a female form, with an interior studded with sharp spikes. The victim was pushed inside and the door was closed slowly, allowing the spikes to gradually pierce the body. Ana was dragged to the execution chamber in the depths of the convent. The sarcophagus awaited her, its outer surface decorated with sacred images that contrasted grotesquely with its purpose. The Virgin Mary carved on the metal seemed to smile as it prepared to receive another victim. The executioners methodically undressed Anna. She tried to maintain her dignity, reciting prayers in Latin to demonstrate her faith. Her words echoed off the stone walls, mingling with the dripping water that marked time like a metronome of death. The sarcophagus door was opened, revealing hundreds of sharp spikes arranged in a precise pattern. Some were short, designed to cause superficial wounds. Others were long enough to pierce vital organs. The arrangement guaranteed prolonged agony before death. Anna was pushed inside. Her feet touched the first spikes, which pierced her soles with sharp pain. She tried to balance on her tiptoes, but the space was too small. Her heels descended inexorably onto the sharp blades. The door began to close slowly. Spikes touched her back, then her shoulders, finally her breasts. Anna screamed desperate prayers, begging for a divine intervention that would never come. Every inch the door closed meant dozens of new wounds. The process lasted 6 torturous hours. The spikes gradually pierced muscles, organs, bones. Anna bled from hundreds of small wounds, her life draining away drop by drop. When she finally fell silent, her blood was trickling through the holes in the sarcophagus, forming red pools on the convent floor. Her family received only her clean-picked bones a week later. Officially, Anna had died of a fever during a spiritual retreat. Her books were burned, her letters destroyed, her memory erased from family records. One of the most brilliant minds of Renaissance Spain disappeared as if she had never existed. While Anna agonized in Seville, Marguerite Porete was wasting away in a Parisian cell. Her legs, destroyed by the iron chair, had developed gangrene. The putrid smell had taken over the dungeon, and other prisoners begged to be moved. Marguerite knew she would die soon. The infection was spreading through her body, causing high fever and delirium. In her lucid moments, she dictated her last words to a literate jailer who had taken pity on her suffering. On June 1st, 1310, she was taken for public execution. Her gangrenous legs could not support her weight, so she was carried on a stretcher to the Place de Grève. A crowd gathered to watch the burning of the heretic who had defied the church. The pyre was prepared with dry wood and pitch to ensure high flames. Marguerite was tied to the central stake, her rotting legs dangling uselessly. When the fire was lit, she still managed to murmur one last prayer. The flames rose quickly, consuming first her clothes, then her skin, already mortified by torture. Marguerite lost consciousness before the fire reached her vital organs, a small mercy after months of agony. Her ashes were thrown into the Seine to prevent relics from being collected by followers. But her writings secretly survived, copied by courageous women who recognized their spiritual value. Centuries later, Marguerite would be recognized as a forerunner of the female mystical movement. Isabella d'Amour's death was quicker, but no less tragic. After 3 days of agony with her breasts destroyed by the Ripper, she succumbed to infection and blood loss. Her last verses were found hidden in a crack in her cell wall. The final poem spoke of physical pain, but also of a deeper sorrow, that of seeing her words silenced forever. Isabella died knowing her poetic voice would be forgotten, that other women would remain prisoners of tyrannical families. Her brothers burned all the manuscripts found in the castle. Only fragments survived, preserved by secret admirers who recognized her wasted talent. Isabella would remain forgotten for 400 years until modern scholars rediscovered her work. Catherine Montvoisin faced an even worse fate. With her face mangled by the pear of anguish, she was kept alive for 2 years in the dungeons of the Bastille. Unable to speak clearly, she communicated through gestures and shaky scribbles. She was finally burned alive in 1682, but the fire could not completely erase the consequences of her case. The affair of the poisons involved so many important figures that Louis XIV ordered all records to be destroyed. Entire dossiers disappeared from the royal archives. Marie Chambon did not survive the 6 hours on the breaking wheel, but her last words echoed through the village for generations. Before she died, she had murmured the names of her 3 little siblings, promising she would come back to take care of them. The children were found starved to death a week later in the hovel where they lived. Without Marie to support them, they simply wasted away. Their skeletal bodies were buried in a common grave along with other victims of the famine that plagued the region. The bakery Marie had robbed closed the following month. The owner, haunted by the young woman's screams, developed a deep melancholy and lost interest in the business. He sold everything for a pittance and moved far away. But he could never forget what he had caused. These 5 women represent thousands of others who suffered similar tortures over the centuries. Their names were erased from official history, their voices silenced, their sufferings minimized or forgotten. Marguerite, Isabella, Catherine, Marie, and Anna had only one thing in common. They dared to exist outside the limits imposed by the society of their time. They thought, they questioned, they created, they survived. Unforgivable crimes for women in societies controlled by men insecure in their own power. The instruments that tortured them were designed specifically to punish female crimes. The iron chair burned women accused of witchcraft. The breast ripper punished real or imagined adultery. The pair of anguish silenced dissident voices. The wheel shattered the bodies of poor women who dared to steal to feed their children. The Iron Maiden devoured intellectuals who questioned religious dogmas. Each instrument carried a perverse symbolism. The chair represented the throne women could never occupy. The Ripper attacked symbols of femininity and motherhood. The pair invaded orifices associated with female sexuality. The wheel broke bodies that were supposed to remain submissive. The Maiden perverted sacred female symbols to cause death. Today, these specific tortures have disappeared. We no longer burn women at the stake. We don't publicly crush breasts. We don't shatter bodies on medieval wheels. But the mentality that created them persists under new masks. Women are still punished for thinking differently, for questioning authority, for refusing imposed roles. The instruments have changed. Now they are discriminatory laws, tolerated domestic violence, systemic harassment, silencing in professional environments. The difference is that today we recognize these practices as crimes. We have international courts, human rights organizations, laws that protect gender equality. The progress is real, but still insufficient. In many countries, women are still stoned for adultery. Millions suffer ritual genital mutilation. Others are burned alive for insufficient dowries. Activists for women's rights disappear mysteriously. The masks have changed, but the cruelty remains. Societies that consider themselves civilized still find sophisticated ways to torture women who dare to challenge established norms. Marguerite Porete wrote about a free soul that needed no intermediaries to connect with the divine. 500 years later, we are still fighting for the right of women to think freely about spirituality. Isabella de Mora dreamed of freedom through literature. Today, female writers in several countries face censorship, death threats, and execution for expressing ideas considered subversive. Catherine Monvoisin provided medical care to poor women. Currently, millions of women still die for lack of access to basic reproductive health care, victims of societies that control their bodies. Marie Chambon stole bread to feed her hungry siblings. In the modern world, single mothers continue to be criminalized for poverty, losing their children to systems that prefer to punish rather than help. Ana de Mendoza questioned religious authorities using theological knowledge. Today, women who challenge patriarchal religious leaders face excommunication, ostracism, and persecution. The story of these 5 women is not just about a distant past. It is a mirror that reflects an uncomfortable present and an uncertain future. As long as societies continue to punish women for existing fully, the ghosts of Marguerite, Isabella, Catherine, Marie, and Anna will remain among us. Their screams echo through the centuries, reminding us that true civilization is not measured by technology or wealth, but by how we treat the most vulnerable. And for a long time to come, women will continue to be vulnerable in a world that sees them as threats when they dare to be free. If this story moved you, share it. The more people know about these horrors of the past, the greater the chance we can prevent them from happening again in the present. The memory of these tortured women is our collective responsibility, and our best weapon against the cruelty that still exists all around us.